The title for my message today is, What is that in your hand? What is that in your hand? And the passage is from Exodus chapter 4, verse 2. That's the main little passage that I'll be focusing in around. But before I really dive into it, I just want to build a little bit of context around my message, I suppose, and also around that passage in particular. So I want to backtrack to Exodus chapter 3 and just give a quick overview. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. It's a fairly well-known account. So I would say probably most people know this, but I just want to touch a few key points there before I really dig into Exodus chapter 4, verse 2. So in Exodus chapter 3, that's the encounter of Moses and the burning bush. So Moses it's a well-known account, and there he is, and his encounter with the burning bush, and he's called to return to Egypt to bring the Israelites out of slavery. So there's a few key points from chapter 3 to sort of set us up here. The first part that I just want to point out in the structure of that chapter is that God introduces himself and makes the relationship in the conversation clear. So he says to Moses who he is, and he establishes that he is God and that Moses is standing on holy ground. So he's really establishing the creator-creation relationship, and I suppose the hierarchy of what this interaction looks like. And then Moses actually postures himself in a way that he understands his place in the relationship. So Moses takes off his sandals. He acknowledges that he's standing on holy ground, and Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So he postures himself in a way where he is acknowledging the holiness and the place of God. And then the next part of the chapter, God makes his intentions clear, which is to emancipate his people from Egypt and send them into the promised land. So God sort of makes that clear to Moses. This is what my intentions are. And Moses is going to be a key part of that, of God's plan. God is going to use Moses instrumentally in this plan to bring his people out of slavery. And immediately, Moses focuses on himself and what he believes about himself, this is an important little distinction from what I'm going to speak about today, because God also focuses in on Moses and what he has, but from a different angle. So we'll get to that shortly. And then God establishes who he is, as in who God is, what his name is, I am, or I will be what I will be. And he makes a statement about his faithfulness in the past, and then therefore invites Moses and his people to have confidence and trust in what he's going to do in the future. Look at what I've done in the past. I've always been a faithful God, and therefore you can trust and have confidence in these outrageous claims, if we're honest. These outrageous claims that Moses is going to go to Pharaoh, who's, the emperor of the world at the time, and in the authority of a God who is unknown to the Egyptian people, is going to set the slaves free. So pretty outrageous claims, just to give a little bit of context, in case you hadn't picked up on it previously. God's saying you can have confidence, because I've done what I've said I'll do in the past. There's no reason that you should doubt me. You can have confidence that I'm faithful, and what I say I'm going to do, that's what I'm going to do. And then there's an acknowledgement from God right near the end of chapter 3. We're getting close to my message for the morning. Getting there, I'm nearly at my introduction. There's an acknowledgement from God that Pharaoh will not respond to mere words. He will not respond unless a mighty hand compels him. So this is not going to be easy. yep, you can have faith in me. I've always done what I said I'll do. You can have confidence that I'll do in the future, that I'll also do what I'm going to do. But Pharaoh, yeah, he's stubborn. Yep, he's mighty. He's got a big army. And he's not just going to, open the gates and set everybody free as soon as you walk in and request it. So there's going to be a bit of hard work here. And he won't respond unless a mighty hand compels him. That's the exact words in there. Unless a mighty hand compels him. So that's set us all up, and it brings us to chapter 4, which I will read, the first part. And Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. And I just want to pause there because that right there is the crux of my message for this morning. And I just want to point something out before I talk around this point a little bit. And it does depend on what version of the Bible that you're actually reading. But that little part there that says, "What is that in your hand?" In some Bibles there's a question mark. And in some Bibles there's a full stop. As in, that's a statement, not a question. Because quite obviously God isn't blind and he knows what's in Moses' hand, and it's not for God's benefit that he's asking this question or making this statement, but it's actually for Moses' benefit to say, "What is that in your hand?" And so I think that's maybe an important little point there. And I want to just talk around that, and I really want to make 2 points this morning. Most sermons generally have 3 points, but I got to the end of my second point and thought this is going to be a really long message, so I'm only going to make 2 points this morning. And let's get stuck into it. What is that in your hand? So in chapter 3, verse 11, and I've already alluded to this, Moses focuses on himself and his inadequacies. And so in chapter 3, verse 11, says, "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?'" And it's interesting that then in chapter 4, verse 2, God then shifts the focus back to Moses again. So he's established all those things that I spoke about. And then God shifts the focus to Moses and what he has in his hand. And so on the one part, Moses is saying, "Well, who am I? What have I got? I'm not good enough. Look at all the things I don't have, or the things that I do have that aren't good enough. I'm not the right guy for this. Go find somebody else," basically. And then God establishes all these points that I just spoke about, and then God shifts the focus to Moses again, but this time from a slightly different angle that we'll see a bit down, and says, "What's that in your hand? Let's have a talk about what you do have. Let's have a talk about who you are and what you bring and how I'm going to use it." And the book of Exodus and what Moses was called into is foundational and pivotal, a pivotal moment in history and in the scripture. The historical account of Israel's exodus from Egypt has lasting theological themes and trajectories through the rest of scripture. So this is a really important passage, and the whole book of Exodus, in setting us up and our understanding of our theology, our foundation, and our relationship to God. Israel's deliverance from Egypt becomes the major paradigm for salvation in the Old Testament. So you can draw links all the way through the book of Exodus through to our salvation in the New Testament. Later, when Israel ends up in exile again because of their sinful rebellion, there's an anticipation for another physical exodus, because the Israelites actually recognized the exodus out of Egypt and the mighty works that God did in establishing who he is, showing his people who he is and how they are to relate to him. They recognized that exodus was actually setting up the whole relationship between God's people and God, who he is who we are and how we are to interact and relate with each other. And so then later on, after Israel's sinful rebellion, they go into exile a number of times. And in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10 to 16, you can read a little bit of a passage there that actually anticipates another exodus out of exile, another physical exodus, because that was their understanding. That's how God relates to his people, was their concept of salvation at the time. Salvation was a physical concept to the people of Israel because of what happened in Israel coming out of Egypt. Then later in Exodus, the Sinai covenant establishes the framework for divine human relationship. The Israelites' failure to keep this covenant throughout the Old Testament leads to the hope of a new covenant. So there's the covenant, the Sinai covenant, which establishes the Old Testament law, which really is the framework for how people are then to relate to God. And the Israelites failed to keep this covenant. They were enthusiastic about it. They were passionate, but they failed to keep the covenant, which eventually led to this real desire, this hope of a new covenant to come. One where people internalize God's covenant requirements by the work of his Spirit. And Jesus inaugurates this covenant in Matthew 26:28, also in Mark 14:24, and Luke 22:20, because he echoes the words of Exodus 24:8, which was the establishment of the first covenant, which is, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins," which is an echo of what happened at the Passover when the Israelites were leaving Egypt. So I'm just drawing some parallels here between the Exodus and the concept of salvation in the Old Testament and how that relates to us today under the new covenant. God also longs to dwell among his people, and originally that was in a tabernacle. So originally God dwelt in a physical tabernacle or a tent, and then through rebellion and idolatry, God was forced to abandon his physical earthly dwelling and destroy it. Because he'd set up this framework, which was just a picture of what was to come, but through sin and rebellion, he abandoned the earthly physical dwelling and he destroyed it. However, he never abandoned the hope of dwelling among his people. Never abandoned hope. In fact, the prophetic hope is an even more glorious temple to come, which Jesus fulfills, and the church, which is us, constitute his dwelling place. So it's no longer a physical building or a tent, but it's actually within us. So that's just to set us up for what happens here. And, we're called, like Moses, to enter into covenant relationship with God. And we're also called, like Moses, to lead others out of slavery and into covenant relationship with God. And we see that in the Great Commission, which is in Matthew 28, verse 19 and 20, which is to go into all the world and make disciples of all men. So it stretches across all nations and all people groups, and it's open to everybody, which is great news. So, what is that in your hand? The first point that I want to make is that the staff that Moses was holding in his hand was quite ordinary. It was quite an ordinary thing, and what was he using it for? Well, he was a shepherd, and it was just a normal instrument, normal tool that he had in his hand, which I doubt was very glamorous. It was probably just a stick that had been crafted a little bit into a rod, and that's what he had. That's all he had in his hand. It was part of the everyday. And so the first point that I want to make, if you're taking notes or just want to want to dot point is do not despise the ordinary. Do not despise the ordinary. Do you know, as Christians, I think, well, this is something that I've certainly, and I'm still probably on a journey to a certain extent, is to find internal peace in what you could call two departments of life, or two parts of our life that can be divided into separate, I guess, pursuits unnecessarily. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean is the sacred, the things that we do that are sacred, and the ordinary, or the secular, or whatever you want to call the physical part of life that are just necessary for living, like eating and sleeping and, weeding the garden and going to work and doing the dishes. All of those things that just don't seem holy at all. There just doesn't seem to be anything special about those. And then there's the things that are sacred, like praying and fasting and going to church and worshipping. And they're just so much more holy and important than putting the kids to bed and reading Frozen to your daughter for the 40,000th time and singing the songs. And so I feel that a lot of the time we really divide our life into the sacred and the secular, and we can sometimes despise the ordinary. And I think there's even a spectrum there where, this thought pattern can go from just an uneasiness where you maybe feel like, oh, I'm just doing so many things that aren't holy because I just only have 24 hours in the day and I need to sleep for, depends who you are, 6 to 14 hours, somewhere there. And I need to eat and I need to get to work and I need to do all these things. And I just, I'm just so unholy because I'm just living and I've got all these things to do. And so it can create an uneasiness where we're not living a unified life, all the way to the end of the spectrum where we can actually have a hatred and punishment of our bodies, which not necessarily anyone in this room, but that is an end of the spectrum where monks, for example, took it to a real extreme where there was an actual hatred for the physical body, and there was a thought pattern that was, if we punish our bodies and physically harm ourselves, that we're glorifying God by doing this. So there's, these, I suppose that's an extreme end of the spectrum, but my point being that we can sometimes despise the ordinary, and going through that kind of a thought pattern is not a way to live a peaceful, unified life, and I don't think it's biblical. I don't think it lines up with New Testament theology. And if we have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, it says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, so, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And so here, something as basic as eating and drinking, which we share with the beasts of the field who live and then die, something as base as that can be done to the glory of God, then can't everything be done to the glory of God? Can't every part of our life be dedicated to the glory of God? And I think, nobody modeled that better than Jesus himself. And I think of a good example in Mark chapter 11, verse 1 to 10, which is where Jesus rides the donkey into Jerusalem, and he shamelessly embraces his humanness, his human limitations, to ride a humble beast into Jerusalem, while also maintaining his royal significance. You know, there's parts of that passage that were significant to the Israelite traditions and culture, which was that it was an unused donkey or colt, depending on the version that you're reading, which means it's fit for royal use because it's unused. And then they threw cloaks over it, which was significant also to recognise that Jesus was royalty. And then also the fact that he was riding on a donkey was symbolic of Solomon's coronation as well. So there was certainly some parts of that passage there that acknowledge that Jesus, I suppose, was acknowledging his place and his royal standing, but also riding in on such a humble beast to acknowledge that he's, I suppose, an example to us in our human limitations. And I think, sometimes that's a good reminder that we need, is that we have limitations. We are human, and there's parts of our lives that are just part of living. And they may not seem glamorous, and they may not seem like they fit into, this grand purpose that God has for our life. But in some ways that it does. And if we do it for the glory of God, then we're fitting in with his purpose. And sometimes our limitations are made more acutely aware to us. I experienced my limitations quite acutely a couple of months ago when I came off my mountain bike. And every year that I get older, I seem to encounter my human limitations a little bit more. But it's good. It's good. It's good to embrace our limitations and not see them as something that holds us back, but something that we can rest in and understand that where our limit is where God can begin. And in John chapter 4, verse 21 to 23, Jesus declares the end of a distinction between the sacred and the secular based on time and place. And shortly afterwards, Paul takes up the cry of liberty, also declaring all meats clean, every day holy, all places sacred, and every act acceptable to God, if we give the glory to God in what we're doing. And so if that's you this morning, old habits die hard, and established mind maps take work to untangle. But to enjoy a unified life, it takes commitment to change and exercising aggressive faith. Every day during dedicated prayer time, commit each day an act to the glory of God. And then throughout the day, many, many, many thought prayers consistently committing each act to God. And so what does that look like? That looks like every morning dedicating that day to God and the ordinary of that day to God. That means throughout the day being thankful to God. And something I learned a couple of years ago, which I thought was great, and maybe it's not done enough, is the tradition of saying grace before dinner. I learnt that actually came from a Hebrew, I won't call it a tradition, it's probably just a cultural way of life that they constantly are just praying for everything, because they're practicing this where they're every day, each step that they take, they're just dedicating it to the glory of God in their everyday. And so, here in our Western Christian tradition, we've just taken a small part of that, and when we sit down to have dinner, generally, it seems to be the most common thing to pray for, not so much breakfast and lunch for whatever reason, but the tradition has stuck that, we pray before we eat for dinner, which is great, but that actually comes from a fantastic practice of every single day in every almost mundane detail of your life, just praying and dedicating that act to God. And what a great way to posture yourself and set yourself up to really live a unified life of all of those things that are so important for our faith walk, which is, reading the Bible and praying and all of the things that would traditionally be considered these holy acts that connect us with God, but to also acknowledge all of the other, physical limiting things that we have to do to survive, to dedicate that to the glory of God as well. And so the first point that I want to make out of this ordinary staff that's in Moses' hand is don't despise the ordinary. Don't despise the ordinary. And then if we just go back to Exodus chapter 4 again, and just read on for the next couple of verses, I'll make my second and final point for this morning. This afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to church. So Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Wisdom. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." And this is probably one of the biggest acts of faith I've seen in the Bible. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake and turned back into a staff in his hand. Thank God I wasn't Moses. I don't know if I would have passed that test. Not good with snakes. Anyway, this, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Do you know, when God said back in Genesis, "Let us make mankind in our image," he created an insurmountable gulf between us and every other creature that he created. There's this mystical connection between mankind and God that doesn't exist with any other part of creation. We can elevate people by building statues of them and putting them in parks. We can write their names on walls in halls of fame. We can award them with prizes. But ultimately, all we can really say is that God gave them a certain type of life. Whatever it is that we're celebrating or elevating them for, ultimately it all comes back to God gave them a certain type of life. And so, every other creature on earth, so long as it remains in its original environment and lives out its God intended purpose, it will live out and fulfill its purpose within that environment, and it will die. So its connection is purely physical, and it's with this earth and this environment for the cycle of the earth to continue on. All the creatures in the air, sea and land live in harmony with that environment. But we are called to something higher, to a deeper connection. And our connection is not just with the land and the animals and the people around us, but we're actually designed and created for a connection with God, something greater than ourselves. And I think that's fairly well understood, but the part that's maybe a little bit more mysterious is how this connection interacts with our physical limitations. So how do we get this connection with holy, perfect, all-powerful God while living within our limitations and our physical humanness? Well, I think the answer is found in the New Testament in a few different passages. One of them being 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 to 11. And so we'll just read that passage. (1 Timothy 6 verse 6 to 11) says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from their faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness." And so I think, the answer to how do we interact with holy God while acknowledging our physical limitations is a contentment which is a satisfaction with where we are and what we have, and a trust in what God will do and where he will take us. So it's both. It's not just being satisfied with where you are and what you have, but it's also then having a trust in God with what he can do with what you have and where he is taking you. And God demonstrates this to Moses through the use of this staff. So what is that in your hand? That's the first thing. Acknowledge what it is. Acknowledge that it's just an ordinary, plain old staff. But as soon as you give it to God and throw it down in front of God, what can he do with that staff? What can he do with what is in your hand? And, another great passage from Paul in the book of Philippians and in chapter 4, verse 11 to 12, also talking about contentment. I'll just read that one as well. Philippians 4, 11 to 12. "I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learnt to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want." And so, Paul just echoes that message of what contentment looks like. And it's not about what we have or where we are, but it's about finding contentment in what we have based on the fact that God can use that. And he can take that and he can take us to places that we could never imagine. And so to give up what you have, little or great, is not easy. It is a sacrifice and it takes faith. And it's important to acknowledge the cost, which was a message that Mark just touched on this morning, to actually, count the cost and then take it before God and pray for a desire and a burden for his will and purpose. And so, I think that's symbolic that Moses had a staff and that God asked him to throw it on the ground, and then he did, a powerful, powerful sign to turn a rod into a snake. I mean, if you've read the story that many times, you can maybe just glaze over the fact that he just turned a staff into a snake, and then Moses picked it up, and it turned back into a staff again. And there's a lot there where, the snake was significant to the Egyptians. They saw it as a sign of power. And so, God really, used the the understanding of the people that he was working with to really drive his point home and show his power. But I think it's symbolic of, what is that in your hand? And then God asks you to throw it down before him. So count the cost. And are you willing to acknowledge the ordinary and acknowledge your limitations and be comfortable and rest in that, and then take what you have and throw it down before God and have faith that he's powerful to use what you have for his purpose. So my question for you this morning is, what is that in your hand? What have you got in your hand? And I think that's a question for the individual, and I think it's a question for us as a group here in Cornerstone. And once again, ties in brilliantly with some of the things we've already spoken about this morning. We have so much. We have this building, this space. We've got a coffee machine. We've got, a great kitchen facility. We're situated in a community where there's people who need to hear the word of God. We've got so many things in our hand already. And I think, it probably depends a little bit on your personality type, but there's certainly a tendency for at least some people to really focus on what they don't have, or what we could have, or what we need, or if we just, or when we get. Then I think that there can be a tendency to do that. And if you're one of those people, I encourage you, stop. What is that in your hand? What is that in your hand? What have you got? Not what don't you have. A phone. Great. If God came to us today, he would probably ask us to throw our mobile phone on the ground just to watch it smash. I don't think it'd turn into anything. It'd just disappear. No, that's a whole nother message. Maybe some of you are focusing on what you lack or what you want. Maybe some of you have been looking at what you have and consider it a burden or a disadvantage. Maybe you're quite happy or satisfied with what you have, but you don't want to throw it down on the ground. You don't want to throw it before God and see what he'll do with it. You'd rather hold on to it yourself and just use it to tend sheep. Because Moses could have not thrown it on the ground and then just gone and used the staff for what he thought its purpose was, not what God had in mind for what was quite ordinary, if not somewhat useful, I'm sure, in the right hands. So, my question for you this morning, if you fit into any of those categories or some version of that, is what is that in your hand? What is that in your hand? And then seek God and establish the relationship. So I spoke about, chapter 3, how there was the setup where God came and he established who he was. And then Moses postured himself in a way where he recognized who he was and who God was in the relationship. And then listen to what God's intentions are. God's intentions for Moses was to go back to Egypt and bring his people out of slavery. And then, once you've done that, present what you have, not what you want or what you think you need or what you used to have, but present what you have there in your hand, throw it down in front of God, and allow him to use it for his purpose and his glory. That's all I had for this morning. Hope you have a fantastic week, everybody.